Today's video is brought to you by War Thunder. Indie game studios have come out with some of the most innovative and awesome games over the last few years, and it's always awesome to see how a small team of developers can form a community of millions of fans. So we're gonna go over 5 of the most loved indie game studios that are out there that basically have zero haters, and compare them to some of the most disliked ones in the industry. Starting off with RelLogic, who's the studio behind the sandbox adventure game called Terraria, which a lot of people like to refer to as 2D Minecraft, but the reality is that the two games actually just couldn't be more different. Despite the fact that both of them are on the list of the best-selling games of all times, I think one of the main reasons why people love RelLogic so much is because despite the fact that Terraria has sold so many copies and it has over 1 million overwhelmingly positive reviews on Steam, they haven't caved in, they haven't sold out to a larger company like how Mojang got acquired by Microsoft. So RelLogic has actually managed to maintain that indie spirit throughout all these years, which puts their already great reputation with the fans at an even better spot because it reinforces the idea that they're focused on keeping the player base happy, and with how much free content they've added throughout the years, they have like more than enough reasons to justify, in the very least, increase the sales price of the base game. But because they want to be as consumer friendly as possible, Terraria's always been available for just under $10. There's even been like a running joke inside the Terraria community because every time RelLogic releases an update for the game, they always announce it as being the final update that Terraria will ever get. And they've been saying that ever since update 1.1 all the way back in 2011, but these developers are just way too obsessed with their game and they just keep coming back for more. So you take the passionate developers, you add transparency towards the community, and put that into one of the best-selling games of all time, and there's like no question as to why RelLogic is one of the most loved indie game studios that's out there. Which is unfortunately the opposite of what you can say about Battlestate Games, which some people consider to be a worse company than Ubisoft themselves. Now, Battlestate Games are the developers behind the king in the extraction shooter genre Escape from Tarkov, and honestly it's just surprising how they've managed to stay on top for so long against all the competition, considering all the controversy surrounding the game's development. So Escape from Tarkov, just to name a few things, has had a laundry list of bugs that throughout the years has never been fixed and only keeps getting worse. There's a rampant cheating problem in the game which makes the extraction shooter genre in specific almost completely unplayable because of the way the games are designed, and there's also the fact that Battlestate Games hasn't really been open with the community about what the future roadmap for Escape from Tarkov is, since the game's been in an open beta stage for over 6 years at this point and there's still no date for a full release. So a lot of people are just speculating that they have really no idea what they're doing with the game, they have no idea what they want to do with the future of the game either. Battlestate Games has also had one of the worst community interactions I've ever seen in any game studio, with the developers being pretty combative with some of the players on social media, especially if we're talking about the biggest controversy that went down when they announced the unheard edition of Escape from Tarkov, which got over 45,000 dislikes versus just 5,000 likes when the trailer first dropped. And Battlestate Games just completely ruined the reputation with how they handled the situation because the unheard edition was a bundle priced at $250 that, out of all the things that they were advertising, the main thing that they were promising was early access to an experimental PvE mode. $250 for a video game that's still in beta, that sounds absolutely wild, but it gets even wilder when you find out that the people who had previously bought the Edge of Darkness edition to support the game's development all the way back in 2017 were not given access to the PvE mode, despite the fact that the original promises for the EOD players was free access to all future DLCs from Escape from Tarkov. So obviously people were feeling like they got ripped off here, and this caused a huge wave of negativity from the community to the point where Battlestate Games was basically forced to cave in, but at that point Battlestate Games had just completely ruined their reputation with the community. But heck, if you like games with awesome communities, then let me tell you about today's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, with over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships. Join the worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles. Every vehicle is incredibly detailed and customizable down to the individual components, and it's available now for free on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. You're gonna feel next level immersion in War Thunder with realistic graphics and authentic sound effects, and the vehicle choices range from armored cars of the 1920s all the way to the state-of-the-art war machines that we have today. And all you need to drive these war machines is your mouse and keyboard or your controller. You don't need any expensive hardware. My favorite part about War Thunder is the impressive X-ray view, where if your vehicle or your enemy is destroyed, War Thunder shows you exactly how it happened, where the shell hit, and what components were affected. And the best part about it all is that if you use my link in the description or the pinned comment, new players and players that haven't played in 6 months will also receive a massive bonus pack that includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, 7 days of premium account, and much more. But this offer is only available for a limited time, so don't forget to claim it now. Now let's talk about Massive Monster, which is one of those dev studios that gained a cult following on social media by making a game that's about gaining a cult following. They're the geniuses behind Cult of the Lamb, which is easily a lot of people's favorite game because it's a roguelite that takes elements from so many different games like The Binding of Isaac, Stardew Valley, Slay the Spire, and just mashes them together in the best way possible. Massive Monster somehow made a game that stands on the perfect sweet spot between the characters being all adorable and funny, you know, like if you were playing Animal Crossing, but also remembering that it's a game about worshipping demonic creatures and committing sacrifices. So Cult of the Lamb came out all the way back in 2022, and over the years, Massive Monster has been working non-stop with the game by adding waves of free major content updates, a few paid DLCs too. My favorite one, and the reason I started playing Cult of the Lamb in the first place, was the fact that they added the Unholy Alliance update, which has a co-op feature, and I'm just a sucker for couch co-op games. It also helps that the developers themselves are super active on social media, like the Cult of the Lamb Twitter X account is one that's always popping up on my timeline, whether they're replying to fans or interacting with them, or just retweeting fan art. And maybe it's not so obvious for some other AAA studios that are out there, but if you want to be loved and recognized by your game's community, then you gotta be there interacting with them, and just sharing the love that other people have for the game that you've made. So overall, Massive Monster is just one of those very few studios that practically have zero haters. But if you want to talk about an indie studio that practically has only haters, then we have to talk about Nicalis, that had reports of their work environment being so hostile that it caused the developer of The Binding of Isaac to basically cut ties with them. So Nicalis is a company that focused not only on developing indie games themselves, but also helping other developers port their existing games into multiple consoles. The studio was part of an investigation done a few years back where the CEO was exposed for not only being exploitative and abusive towards his employees, but also making a lot of racist comments in the office. A few of the Skype messages got leaked online, and honestly speaking, after going through some of these messages, it's surprising anybody would want to keep working for this company. But that Skype chat log was looking like your typical Twitter timeline, honestly. And if that wasn't enough reasons to hate Nicalis, well, remember how they were in the business of porting video games? Well, they've also been called out for releasing ports for games that kind of just felt rushed and riddled with so many bugs that they really didn't feel like they were doing the original games any justice. Like, the biggest example in this case was when the original Cave Story was ported into the Nintendo Wii. Like, I never got the chance to play that version, but from what I hear, it's an absolute disaster. And they've also destroyed any opportunity they've ever had to build a proper community, since they've been known to request DMCA takedowns of fan-made Cave Story projects, despite the fact that Cave Story itself was originally released as a freeware by a Japanese indie developer called Pixel. But with so many reasons to hate Nicalis as a company, well, it's no surprise that people just outright refuse to buy anything if it has their name attached to it. Which is something that we can't really say about this next studio called Team Cherry. Now, Team Cherry is a group of just like 3 people that have made one of the best Metroidvania games out there called Hollow Knight. And Hollow Knight was such a massive success that it created one of the most hardcore fan bases you'll ever see in any gaming community that's out there, because the game is fun, yeah, but it also has a beautiful artwork that's all been hand-drawn, and the way Team Cherry has been able to craft an atmosphere to make it seem all dark and mysterious, and make it feel like you're almost playing a Souls game where you're trying to piece together all the lore with all the hints that the game drops, it's just a masterpiece, honestly. However, Team Cherry hasn't been without controversy though, because unfortunately there's been a lot of members of the community that, yeah, they are absolutely obsessed with Hollow Knight, but they're also kind of frustrated with how quiet Team Cherry has been about the development of their next game, Hollow Knight Silksong, which was announced over 5 years ago at this point, and despite the fact that it's currently the most wishlisted game on Steam, well, there's barely been any information regarding it, so every time there's a major gaming event like E3 or Nintendo Direct or something like that, there's always that same feeling of disappointment when there's no mention of Hollow Knight Silksong. But I will say that to their defense, there is a good reason for that, because Team Cherry, like I mentioned, is literally just 3 people, and because they know how passionate and driven their fan base is, and how much they appreciate their work on Hollow Knight, well, they've mentioned in the past that even just making devlogs could set them back for weeks in development, so they've chosen to just, keep their heads down, work in silence, so they can come out with a properly made game, instead of just trying to rush the release of Hollow Knight Silksong, because at the end of the day, they just really want to do well with their fans. I'm pretty sure they just don't want to end up like Fantastic, which was a dev studio that had one of the most dramatic crashes in recent gaming history. They were the team behind the disaster called The Day Before, that was supposed to be an open-world survival MMO game that, based off the trailers and what the studio was promising, it was supposed to be like The Last of Us combined with The Division. But the problem was that all that Fantastic was showing regarding the game were all these like super high quality cinematic trailers that got a bunch of people to wishlist the game on Steam, so everybody was hyped, but they never really showed any gameplay. So after going through months and months of delays in development and them not really talking much about the game, and also the fact that the game was delisted on Steam over a copyright issue with the name, everybody started calling the day before a scam that was never going to be released. But Fantastic eventually did manage to release the game, by the way, but the people who bought it still got scammed in the end, because once they booted up the day before, they realized that it wasn't really an open world MMO game like how it was advertised, but it was actually an extraction shooter with a pretty empty environment that was just filled with a bunch of flipped assets, and the AI on the zombies was so horrible that it made the whole thing feel like it was more like a tech demo than anything else. Like, it was nothing more than a classic bait and switch at the end of the day that made Fantastic go from having one of the most top wish-listed games on Steam to being one of the most hated indie studios of its time. They also apparently had horrible business practices, because it came out way later that a lot of the development was actually being made by unpaid volunteers that were being exploited in order to get free labor in exchange for cool rewards like participation certificates and free codes. Listen, this whole disaster with the day before and Fantastic was so bad that after 4 days of the day before being launched in December of 2023, Fantastic came out with a statement announcing that they were shutting down the studio and that their game had failed financially. And looking back, honestly, they probably should have taken a page from Supergiant Games on how to make a successful indie release, because when it comes to storytelling and captivating visuals and, you know, just having that sweet sauce that gets the player hooked, it's really hard to compete with Supergiant Games. That's a developer behind the titles like Bastion, Transistor, and Pyre, which are, you know, reputable games by themselves, but the game series that turned Supergiant Games into the viral sensation that it is today has got to be the Hades series. With the first Hades game being released in 2020, it's a roguelike action game inspired from Greek mythology that sold millions of copies and won multiple Game of the Year awards for how they use the roguelike gameplay structure of having individual runs in order to push the story forward through multiple playthroughs. And honestly speaking, anybody who's played Hades before knows how easy it is to get invested in it and just accidentally end up dumping a ton of hours into it. So naturally, when the sequel entered early access back in May, people just went absolutely crazy for it too. Like, one of the most common things you hear people talk about online as to what separates Supergiant Games from any other studio in the industry is that they say that the games released by them feel like they have heart. You know, they feel like they've been polished to the max, where everything in the game just feels complete. You know, from the art style to the world building, the complex characters, like nothing about this game feels like it was rushed or half-assed just to meet a deadline. And from what I managed to read online, the developers at Supergiant Games actually have one of the best working conditions out there because they've had so many successful releases in the past. So that way the company doesn't have to deal with crunch time for the developers, and they actually have forced vacation days to stop them from overworking. It's almost as if treating your employees properly lets them work with passion and drive, and as a result of that, the community ends up getting amazing games. You know, maybe this next studio should really be taking notes, because this next one is like two completely different realities, because the studio is called Mountains, and it's responsible for an adorable and very heartwarming game called Florence, which is an interactive novel filled with a bunch of little mini games inside of it. And it's about a 25-year-old girl who falls in love and dreams about following her passion. Right? Sounds adorable. It's a quick little 30-minute experience that you can get on Steam for only $6 that's even won awards for Best Mobile Game too. But there's a problem with that apparently, because while this adorable and cute little game was being developed, there was actually a lot of chaos and harassment happening inside the studio at Mountains. And a lot of it was actually coming from the very top of the mountain by the creative lead and founder of the studio called Ken Wong. One of the lead developers for Florence came out with a statement online talking about how Ken Wong was controlling and abusive at the studio, and a lot of the times would just undermine other people's mental health struggles. He stated that his body would literally just stop working because he couldn't handle the daily abuse he received from Ken, and it got to the point of depression where this lead developer was actually considering uninstalling IRL. Another staff member at Mountains also described Ken Wong as being a cruel person in a position of power who liked to make other people feel bad to make himself feel better. But because Ken was practically the face of the company because of his recognition on his previous work on Monument Valley, well, it's not like you could just bring up the issue with the boss. You know, he was the boss. Like, imagine trying to work on a soft and beautiful cozy video game while having to put up with these horrible conditions every single day. Like, it just sounds absolutely terrible. But when the story actually managed to get some traction online, Ken did issue a public apology for his behavior with the other staff members at Mountain Studio, and they even had to implement a rule inside the studio where people were just outright allowed to deny one-on-one meetings with him if they didn't feel like they were being treated right. And for the one indie company that people to this day still debate on whether it really is indie or not, because it doesn't really fit the image of what you think about when you think about indie studio. But regardless of what people see it as, you can't deny that Larian Studios is one of the most loved studios out there that's won multiple awards and nominations for Baldur's Gate 3 specifically, but they're also famously known for their previous games like the Divinity series. And Larian Studios has built a lot of the goodwill that they have with the community just through like the sheer quality that their games have that really helps people just connect with them better. I think a lot of it just has to do with how, despite the fact that Larian Studios is technically an independent developer who's not really controlled by any publisher, they still have access to that AAA budget because of how successful they've been throughout the years, and as a result of all that budget that they have for their games, usually they can aim pretty high with the scope of what they're working on. I think this one comment here is like the best example of how the fans feel about Larian Studios. Larian does not promise anything it cannot do, and they have never failed to deliver a game. They won't be releasing a game that's a buggy mess. This is not my first rodeo with them. And even the people at Larian, whether it's talking to the fans online or accepting an award on stage, they always seem to have a sense of gratitude towards their audience that, you really just don't see in too many studios out there. Because usually we see things from the other perspective, usually we see us thanking the developers for all their hard work, but I suppose seeing that level of kindness come from them really just earns them a lot of good points with the community, and maybe that's why people love them so much. Alright, and this next one really isn't a studio per se since it's just like one developer, but it's still worth mentioning because of the amount of controversy that they've had over the years. We have to talk about Wole and the game called Cube World, which a lot of people call the most disappointing indie release of all time. You see, when Cube World was first shown off back in 2011, it caught a lot of people's attention pretty quickly because the game was selling the idea of exploring a procedurally generated world with RPG elements, and overall it was looking like it was going to be a really fun game to play. A lot of people got hyped up and started following Wole's development journey, and those suspicions would later be confirmed when Wole initially released an alpha back in 2013 that got overwhelmingly positive feedback from the community. But then problems started arising during the game's development where Wole would just go absolutely silent on social media for months at a time, even for years at certain points, and it got to the point where people thought that the game was just being abandoned. So naturally a lot of the fans were left feeling disappointed, but it wasn't until 6 years later in 2019 that Wole just decided to randomly come back and announce that Cube World was almost ready, and it was going to get an official release on Steam. So at that point, hopes were high once again. But what ended up happening is that when people actually got the chance to play this official Cube World that had been hyped up for so many years, well, they realized that the final release was way different from the alpha version that people originally loved, and the game was missing a lot of features that were either promised or just outright already present in the alpha. So not only did the official release feel incomplete, it was actually worse than what the fans originally got all the way back in 2013. So naturally, it left a lot of people feeling scammed when they bought Cube World, and to make matters worse, shortly after Cube World's official release, Wole would then again, go silent on social media. So it's almost like if he just wanted to release the game just to say that he did it and people would stop bugging him and just be able to move on afterwards. So because of all of that, the fans who were initially super hyped up and hopeful for Wole were just left with a sour taste on their mouths because of all the money they spent on Cube World. And to pour a little bit more salt in the wound, now Wole in 2023 announced Cube World Omega, which is a completely new project, and now people who were originally scammed or ripped off, whatever you want to call it, by the original Cube World are wondering like, hey, is this going to be another Cube World episode? Is this going to be, do I have to pay for this again after I supported you with the original Cube World? Nobody really knows. But all I know is that a lot of the goodwill that Wole had with his community has now been basically thrown out the window at this point. A shout out to War Thunder again for sponsoring today's video. Don't forget to play for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox now using the link in the pinned comment or the video description, and that new and returning players that haven't played in 6 months can receive a massive bonus pack including premium vehicles, in-game currency, and a lot more.